They've been doing this all along. I mean, how long have they been calling us climate deniers for merely asking to see the evidence on CO2?
The people of Australia have been asking the Prime Minister to clarify.
Just a little bit of a party here in the studio just to celebrate. It's halfway, mate. What an incredible achievement. Well, before we get started with today's episode, I come to you with absolutely thrilling breaking news, really. We're coming to you just a few hours before this show goes live to air. And I want to cross to a face that you've seen a few times here on the Aussie Wire. Matt Lawson, how are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks, Topher. How are you?
Doing very well. Now, this is far more exciting than arriving in Dubbo ought to be. But what is the significance of arriving in Dubbo for you?
So we've made it to Dubbo, just a short 5Ks in, but by the time your show airs, by the magic of TV, we'll be in Dubbo. It's halfway. So we're super excited to be halfway through the journey. Now we're going to start counting down to get to Brisbane.
Yeah, halfway through an incredible walk from Melbourne to Brisbane. I know I can't be there with you, but I just wanted to have a little bit of a party here in the studio just to celebrate. It's halfway, mate. What an incredible achievement. I did realise, I was thinking about you this week, and I realised you've made a bit of a mistake though. By walking from Melbourne to Brisbane, if you have a look at a map, you're going up pretty much the whole way. Like it's hard work. But if you'd walked from Brisbane to Melbourne, you look at the map, you would have been going down. I think that would have been a lot easier for you, don't you reckon?
I got it all upside down. Yeah, all upside down and higgledy-piggledy. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. And next time I'm going to go from Brisbane. I might just walk back.
Yeah. It'd be a piece of cake in comparison. You're doing it the hard way. Mate, Godspeed. Go well. I'm thrilled for you. I'm sure you're still receiving incredible support all the way along the way. We're going to drop all of your links back into the description of this video so that people can support you and your fundraising for Jab Injuries Australia, and people can follow your Facebook page, find out where you're headed and meet you along the way and give you the support that you so richly deserve. Matt Lawson, halfway. Congratulations.
Thanks, Topher, and everyone get onto the Aussie Wire. Give them a big, huge follow. Thanks,
Cheers.
mate.
I found myself in a very interesting conversation with one of the guests at the Church and State Conference in Perth last weekend. She was young, studying politics, and had recently begun to question many of the things that she had previously taken for granted. She was eager to ask questions and to listen, and so, without wanting to be accused of mansplaining, I found myself making the case for human rights, those being the right to life, liberty, and property. And I was making that case in a way that was different and I think better than the way I've ever done that before. To be clear, I'm not claiming credit for this particular way of approaching the issue. I was just repackaging and re-expressing ideas that have been passed down from some of the greatest minds in history. Much like my slogan, good people break bad laws. It's not actually a new idea, it's just my modernisation of thousands of years of philosophy. In the same way, this conversation that I had wasn't new. I'm not claiming credit for anything groundbreaking. But I think the way that it came out was useful. We were at the gala dinner in a circle, and I couldn't make reference to the great philosophers and thinkers who developed concepts such as natural law or the rule of law. I didn't have access to pithy quotes or to graphs or to data or to anything really. We were simply sitting down to dinner, and I had to make the case for human rights, including life, liberty and property, in a way spontaneously without relying on any external authority or information. I simply had to make an argument that started from a mutually agreed starting point and then build a case for rights that was logical and internally consistent. The argument made sense within itself. I want to share the outcome of that conversation with you today because I think what we did at that table, rather accidentally, is make a case for human rights that is so simple that it can be communicated by anyone to anyone, but is still so logically robust that it becomes profoundly convincing. And I think this will sway many, if not most, of the skeptics. I might be wrong, of course, and you can judge it for yourself. But let's give it a go, shall we? The starting point, and really the only leap of faith needed in this whole argument, is this. We need to start by agreeing that you have the right to not be killed for someone else's benefit. If we can agree on this starting point, then all other rights related to life, liberty, and property naturally follow. We just have to start here. You have the right to not be killed for someone else's benefit. Notice I'm not even asking you to agree that you have the right to not be killed full stop, only for someone else's benefit. You don't have the right to not be killed, for example, if you throw yourself off a cliff, or if you develop a terminal illness, or if you attack somebody and they defend themselves. You don't have the right to immortality or the right to immunity from the consequences of your actions. You have only this: the right to not be killed for someone else's benefit. Now, I'm not saying that that's the limit of your right to life. I'm just finding an absolute minimal starting point from which we can build. So, can we agree that you have the right to not be killed for someone else's benefit? And more particularly, can we agree that this is true without having to sort of make the case? It's true because it's true. Call it God's law, call it natural law, call it human rights, give it whatever label you like. If we can just agree on this starting point, then everything else follows. Okay, so probably 98% of the human population would agree with this starting point, and that's going to have to do. So you have the right to life, or more specifically, to not have your life taken off you by others for their benefit. If that's true, then what's the limit on that? If you were mere months away from dying of a terminal illness, for example, would it become okay for someone to kill you? After all, they're not really taking away your whole life. They're just taking away a few months at the end. Maybe they're your kids and they want an early inheritance, or maybe they're some kind of an opponent or an enemy taking their last shot at revenge before you die of natural causes. Whatever the agenda, is it okay for them to kill you if you only have a few months or weeks or days or even hours to live? No, because taking your life is a violation of your right to life, regardless of how much of it is taken. Right, so with that basis, we can take now another step. If you have the right to life, and you have the right to live all of that life and not have it shortened or curtailed, then you must have the right to live uncurtailed. If it's wrong to take your life, even just a few weeks or months of it, then we can determine that it's wrong to force you to live as a slave, for example. If I can't take a few weeks or months of your life itself, then neither can I take away weeks, months, or years of your life in unjust servitude against your will. Oh, but I didn't kill them. I didn't take away their life. Well, that isn't good enough. You're taking away their life one day at a time by making them live in a way that they did not choose to live. And so violating someone's right to live is violating their right to life. Kidnapping, slavery, locking someone away in your basement for a few years, all of that is wrong automatically. It doesn't matter how nicely you treat your slaves, and believe it or not, some slave owners used to make that argument, oh, but I treat my slaves very well. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how comfortable your basement may be. Taking away their liberty to live is taking away their right to their life. This is, in fact, where the right to liberty comes from. It follows directly from the right to life. If you don't have the right to take their life, then you don't have the right to control their living. So if we can agree that we all have the right to life, i.e. the right to not be killed for someone else's benefit, then we must agree that we also have the right to live as we see fit, provided we're not violating the equal rights of others in the process. And that's a key in all of this, that our rights, by virtue of being inherent and based on our humanity, are all equal. It's not only you that has the right to life, all humans do. It's not only you that has the right to liberty, all humans do. So the very same rights that constrain others from harming you also constrain you from harming others. And just as taking away only a little bit of someone's life is still a violation of their right to life, so taking away only a little of someone's liberty is still a violation of their right to live. Letting someone be mostly free is still violating their right to freedom, just as letting someone live most of their natural life is still violating their right to life. So, we have now, very simply and with basic logic, deduced the right to liberty directly from the agreed right to life. If you have the right to life, you have the right to liberty. You cannot defend one without defending both. What about property, though? Life, liberty, and property. Surely stealing from someone isn't the same as kidnapping someone or killing them. The right to private property cannot possibly be deduced simply from the right to life, can it? Well, actually, it can. What is property? It is the product of the way that you have lived, the product of your life, or in some cases, if you're lucky, it might be the product of your ancestors' lives if they passed it down to you. Why does one person have a big house and an expensive car and another one is just getting by and owns nothing? Well, there's some luck in there for sure, but largely it's a result of their choices about how they have lived, how they have used their life and liberty up to that point in time. That money took years to save. That's value that you generated using years of your life. If you have the right to your life, and you have the right to live your life in liberty, then you also have the right to the proceeds of your life and your living. You chose to live in such a way that you created more money, more value than you consumed. More than you consumed. You could have consumed everything month to month like a lot of people do, but you chose to sacrifice your lifestyle in the moment so that you could build a surplus and you could save towards the future. That means that to steal a $30,000 car isn't really taking away money, it's taking away the months and years spent earning that money. To swindle $100,000 from a retiree isn't only taking away the years they spent saving that money, it's also taking away the living that they would have enjoyed with the benefit of that money going forward. In a sense, damaging, destroying, or stealing property is actually a double whammy. To take away property is to take away the years already lived to earn it and the living yet to come enjoying it. And as with the rights to life and liberty, taking away even a little of someone's property rights is still a violation of that person's rights. Stealing is stealing whether the person being stolen from can afford it or not. So all we have to do is to agree that you have the right to not be killed by someone else for their benefit. And all of a sudden the rights to life, liberty and property emerge through basic deduction. There is a lot more to it, of course. There's many things that are falsely called human rights which aren't. And there is much to be discussed about the implications of these rights, what it means in practice, and what is to be done when rights are violated. We'll get to those discussions in due course here on the Aussie Wire. But for now, I hope that you found this very basic discussion on rights interesting, stimulating. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Have I missed something? Either way, do let me know in the comments, and let's talk about human rights, and let's discover how we can communicate these rights in ways that everyone can understand. For now, though, here's the news. Well, on Tuesday's episode of the Aussie Wire, I talked about the incredible significance of what's happening in West Australia with the impending repeal of the heritage laws that were passed over there. And of course, in the weeks before that, we introduced you to Nick Goiran MP. He's a West Australian Member of Parliament who brought to us the story about the incredible uproar, the incredible pushback that was taking place from grassroots people in Western Australia against these laws that were infringing upon their property ownership rights. Well, I thought the best person to bring us an update, as this story is evolving and changing very, very quickly, would of course be Nick Goiran himself. Thank you so much, Nick, for coming back on the Aussie Wire to bring us an update.
It's so good to be with you, Topher. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this exciting development and to continue to give listeners and viewers hope that it is worth getting involved.
That's absolutely right, Nick. And for those that haven't perhaps seen Tuesday's episode or haven't been across the news, there was these laws, these heritage laws that were rammed through by Labor. Once they actually came into effect, they caused all kinds of issues. Even things like tree planting were interrupted. People were outraged. They got involved. They got on their feet. Can you bring us up to speed? There's been some conjecture about whether this repeal was actually going to happen or not. It was said that it was going to happen, and then there wasn't an official confirmation. Can we confirm once and for all this repeal is definitely happening?
Topher, I can certainly confirm that there is now a repeal bill in the Western Australian Parliament. It's quite understandable that people were completely confused because there were rumours in the so-called mainstream media, evidently leaked by the Cook Labor government. But then we had an extraordinary set of circumstances where for 3 days over the weekend, the Premier essentially went into hiding. And multiple media outlets, of course, and Western Australia's wanted confirmation that this was going to happen. Look, be that as it may, time has marched on, as it does in politics, and there is a bill that is presently in the Western Australian Parliament, and this is a great win for democracy.
Well, we've had that confirmed now from Premier Roger Cook's Twitter. I mean, that appears to be about as authoritative as it gets these days. It is a mouthpiece directly from Premier Cook. But as you say, the mainstream media have done no favours to anyone in trying to help us understand what's going on. They have finally caught up. They have finally announced that it is definitely going ahead. You mentioned that this is a great win for democracy, and I think that's a really good thing for us to talk about for a moment here, because I don't know about you, contradict me if you've seen anything else that's done this. I haven't seen an issue energise so many people so quickly before in any state of Australia, let alone nationally. Have you?
Look, I think that's fair, Topher. I mean, I've certainly seen protests. You might recall, certainly in Western Australia, we had a outrageous situation where we had never-ending state of emergency declarations here. That invoked massive protests, ones that I've never ever seen before here in Western Australia. But if I can compare and contrast that to this situation here, as you quite rightly pointed out, the strength of the protest by the people of Western Australia was so great in such a short period of time. And indeed, there was an official parliamentary petition that was tabled to the tune of more than 29,000 signatures. Now, to put that in some kind of context, in the West Australian context, that is enormous. In fact, it's a record electronic petition. And it is, as I say, a win for democracy.
Well, all I'd like to say is well done to everyone that signed that petition, well done to everyone that protested, well done to everyone that showed up to the various town hall meetings that sprung up all over Western Australia. It's a huge geographic region, and I've no doubt that a lot of people drove literally hours to attend those meetings, to voice their concerns, to be a part of that pushback. Where to from here, Nick? The people have risen, the people have spoken. Is there a risk now that they say, oh, well, that problem's solved and we'll just go back to what we were doing? Or do you think that this is going to last, that there's going to be a lasting change coming out of this?
Oh, well, look, there's a number of things that need to happen now. I mean, starting with an apology from the Premier. I mean, you have put out that tweet from the Premier, and in there, I find it just absolutely appalling that he says that the legislation has unintentionally caused division. Now, this is the Premier that when concerns were raised, referred to such people, including the members of the opposition, as racists, and that we were the equivalent of dogs returning to our vomit. This was the language of a supposedly statesman-like Premier of Western Australia. Now, at the end of the day, thankfully, the people of Western Australia have won this debate and democracy has won, but at the very least, a humble apology from the Premier for those comments which were vilifying people who showed dissent to his decision. That's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing is that the people of Western Australia, and certainly the legislators, those of us here in the WA Parliament, must remain on high alert, because this is a government that has form of saying one thing and doing another. And I'll give you an example, Topher, that last year we had a situation where the government finally relented on these never-ending state of emergency declarations. It had descended into nothing short of high farce with an emergency minister who wasn't even reading the advice that had been provided to him from the so-called chief health officer that was going to justify these declarations. Meanwhile, you had the Premier and the Deputy running around Europe inviting tourists to come to Western Australia when we were supposedly in a state of emergency. Now, that high farce ended because there were 3 parliamentary petitions, official parliamentary petitions, tabled by me, thanks to the people of Western Australia, and in the end, that stopped those state of emergency declarations. But you see, with sleight of hand, what the West Australian government then did is they transferred those so-called temporary COVID emergency powers from the government and the minister to the police commissioner. And that has incensed a number of people. Thankfully, those so-called temporary powers are due to expire in 2024. But we have to be careful of sleight of hand here from the Cook Labor government. And that's why earlier this week, Topher, I've specifically asked the Premier as to whether he intends to create a voice to the West Australian Parliament. And he has refused to unequivocally rule that out. And that's the type of sleight of hand nonsense that I am watching very, very closely for.
That's a great point, actually, and I didn't grab that. I did come across that when researching for today's interview, that he has refused to rule that out, which in political speak is basically confirmation that your hunch is correct. He does have that kind of a plan in the works. Is it not true, and I'm not entirely sure the answer here, this is a question without notice, Nick Goiran MP, so feel free to put this off to a later date if you need to, but is it not true that the proposed federal voice, were it to be passed, were it to be successful in the referendum, would also have the ability to instruct or to consult with, or whatever mealy-mouthed language they're using, state and local governments in addition to federal? Would that not be a de facto voice to the state parliaments as well?
Well, look, I mean, this is one of the technical points that we, being the people of Australia, have been asking the Prime Minister to clarify. And in Western Australia, I have twice asked the former Premier, Mr McGowan, to release the advice that he has kept secret on the impact for Western Australia on a federal voice should the referendum get up, which I hope it doesn't. And then I have asked the replacement Premier, Mr Cook, and he has also refused to do so. Now, this refusal to release this important information prior to the referendum makes me highly suspicious as to what is contained in this advice that they have received. There's no good reason why full transparency shouldn't apply. And meanwhile, with regard to a WA voice, a voice to the WA Parliament, keep in mind here that when Mr McGowan resigned, there were two chief contenders to replace him. One was Minister Amber Jade Sanderson, the other was the Deputy Premier, Mr Cook. Now, in February of this year, this senior minister, Amber Jade Sanderson, has said that she is certainly in favour of the creation of a voice to the WA Parliament. Right. So that's his chief, opponent in government, his chief threat to the premiership. And I've asked him about that this week, and as I say, he refuses to unequivocally rule it out. At the end of the day, in Western Australia, we do not support a voice to the federal parliament and government. I'm confident Western Australia is going to say no at this referendum, and I hope that a majority of states join us here in Western Australia. And under no circumstances do we want any sleight of hand from the Cook Labor government to then sneak in through the back door a voice to the West Australian Parliament.
Last question for you before we're out of time here. The situation for the Liberal Party in West Australia was pretty dire at the last election. There's no way of putting lipstick on that pig. It was an absolute shellacking. Then Premier Mark McGowan was riding high on a wave of popularity, and that was reflected in the polls. One of the things that we've seen come out of this schmozzle that has been these West Australian heritage laws is a sharp turnaround in the polls, in fact now showing that the West Australian Liberal Party would indeed win were an election to have been held at the time of the most recent poll. I believe it was a 54 to 46 two-party preferred result, but don't quote me on that. Again, similar to my question earlier, but now on the polling, do you believe that that's a real thing? Are people simply venting frustration, or have we really seen this one issue completely change the political landscape in WA?
I think, Topher, here that it is important that that type of commentary is best left to the likes of yourself and others to make judgments on that. I will just simply relay a few facts. One is that the Premier of Western Australia has changed. And whatever people might have thought about the former Premier, Mark McGowan, we've now got a completely different character here in Premier Cook. The second thing is that it is a fact that the rollout of the Aboriginal cultural heritage regulations was nothing short of shambolic, to the point now that only weeks ago, really, when we were being referred to as dogs, reverting to our vomit, that we now have that same person who vilified us in that regard now repealing that legislation that we showed concerns about. And the third point I'd make, Topher, to that commentary is that we have recently had a by-election in the seat of the former Premier, and there was a 23% swing against the government. So all of those factors have to, at the very least, be sending a message to the government as to where that puts the Liberal Party. Well, look, at the end of the day, as I've always said in 14 years of service in the Parliament, it's not about winning. It ought not to be about winning. If we're only concerned about winning, then we've lost already. What we need to be doing is fulfilling our duty to the people of Western Australia, whether you're in government or in opposition. And at the moment, for the Liberal Party, that means holding the government to account. Clearly, we have done that in this latest example, but we must remain on high alert because these guys have got form.
That is a superb answer from a consummate politician. If anyone wants to understand how politicians ought to behave, both answering the question and avoiding the elements of the question they don't want to talk about, you can study Nick Goiran MP's answer right there. That was superb. And thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire once again. Congratulations on this particular win. I think you've done the people of Western Australia a huge favour, and I can only hope, speaking personally, that we see people stay engaged with politics, that they don't simply go back to their lives as they were before, and that we see people being much more engaged going forward. Nick Goiran MP, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Topher. Much appreciated.
The national broadcaster costs Australian taxpayers over $1.1 billion every single year, and I think it's fair for us to ask, what do we get in return for our money? Well, some of the ABC staff seem to get a few perks, such as flights across the country from the East Coast all the way to Perth to cover a story that has raised a lot of eyebrows and even more questions. Our science correspondent, Joanne Nova, joins us from Western Australia to discuss this story. Not quite a breaking story. It broke about a week ago, but it is a developing story. We're seeing this crazy situation, Joanne, where the ABC have been accused of having known in advance about criminal activities, and instead of reporting it to the cops, they tried to have a camera crew on hand to catch it. Tell us the story.
Look, it's the most bizarre thing, Topher. Hard to believe that it unfolded the way it did. But the chief of Woodside, Ms. O'Neill, Meg O'Neill, lives in City Beach in Perth and woke up, I think, Monday morning last week to people harassing and menacing her on her front door. They had chains and padlocks. They were going to lock her in to prevent her leaving, and they had been out and scoped the house the day before, surveilled it from both the front and the back to see when she left home for work, which was about 10 to 7 in the morning. And so they turned up, then, this small bunch of activists, incredibly, with an ABC unit in tow, full cameramen and everything at her home. And to put this in perspective, I tried to think of the last time that people were really harassed in home, and I'm back to the days of the mafia. You know, that's the kind of thing they would do. We know where you live. And so that's where this is at. And the reason a science correspondent is discussing this is, of course, because it was climate change. And the whole idea, you know, that these activists were saying the CEO of Woodside Energy will, in their words, emit 6 billion tonnes of carbon over the next 50 years. And that was the justification for going to someone's house with her partner and her teenage daughter. And this is before dawn in Perth, remember, because the sun rises at 7:05 at the moment. So they were there before dawn. And wouldn't you know it, the ABC had a crew too. And Toby, the most extraordinary thing was that this crew was flown from Sydney.
It's an incredible story. Now, this was Miss Meg O'Neill's response, and I think she's spot on here. This was designed to threaten me and my daughter in our home. And for me, that takes what these activists have done out of the realm of protest and into the realm of criminality. I think the mafia type of analogy is not actually an unfair one. They have literally gone out of their way to engage in criminal activity. But in a sense, we kind of expect that from the activists. We don't expect the ABC to join in. Now, there's a couple of interesting responses from The Guardian here as they've tracked the story over various days. So press freedom advocates have actually come out in The Guardian, as reported by The Guardian, supporting the ABC and supporting flying a crew from one side of the country to another to cover known criminal activity on someone's private residence on behalf of some climate activists. We have another response here, the ABC actually defending, now this was early on, defending the Four Corners crew who went to that planned protest at the CEO's home. This raises an enormous amount of questions, not least of all just basic professionalism and journalistic integrity, does it not?
Well, the ABC's excuse when faced with it on the day, and let's put this in perspective, on the night that this happened, the morning that it happened, it was the biggest breaking news in WA. It was covered that evening in the news by every channel here, except the ABC, the only channel that had a TV crew on site on the morning, didn't mention it at all. They must have gone back to their offices and gone, holy, we need our lawyers and we need to start talking. And their excuse was just hilarious, that they came out and said, look, we flew over there, but we didn't know which house we were going to or that it was a private home.
Or
What happened to Google Earth searches, finding out where you're flying a 5-hour flight and a whole camera crew too? It doesn't wash.
Well, at best, that speaks of complete carelessness when it comes to spending taxpayers' dollars if they are flying them halfway or all the way across the country without really knowing what they're actually getting up to. But the reality is that at least 2 of the activists that were a part of that stunt were actually already out on bail. They were known to be the kinds of people that would engage in these kinds of very marginal, let's just say, or I'll be nice, very marginal kinds of forms of protest. And may I say, with all due respect, not necessarily the sharpest tools in the shed. Here is one of them being quoted in the West Australian immediately afterwards. Having been asked about what she was doing and being asked questions about climate change, her response was, "Don't ask me, I'm just a university student." Well, no, I'm sorry. If you're just a university student, you'd be at university or doing university student things. You wouldn't be showing up to the private residence of the CEO of Woodside and engaging in that kind of activism. There appears to me, at the very least, to be a stridency that started to come in. We see this with Just Stop Oil. We see this with stunts like this. Is this a new phase of the climate change alarmist movement that we're seeing here, or is this an aberration that we can hope will disappear in due course?
No, this is a trend that's been going on for years. When you've run out of evidence, when you can't persuade people through an honest debate and an argument, all that's left is bullying, intimidation, name-calling. They've been doing this all along. I mean, how long have they been calling us climate deniers for merely asking to see the evidence on CO2? So this is the way it always ends if, except the intimidation keeps getting worse if they're still in a position of power and they haven't been pulled back. And here we say, in the case of what you're doing, the rise of new media, because people are just fed up with watching these kind of stories happen on the news and not seeing what they would consider a rational response. I mean, consider what these activists were doing. It was literally a siege. They were kind of planning to hold her hostage in her own home with her teenage daughter. Now, just think for a minute. Imagine that you had warning that someone was going to go to the local school and hold students hostage in it. What's the right thing to do? Should I call the police and let them know this is coming and it could be potentially a criminal act, or should I go along with the cameras to film it?
I'd be
every adult in the room, except the ABC, knows the answer to this.
I'd be reaching for my phone and saying, "Hey, can I live stream it while you break the law?" Of course, that's what every reasonable adult would do, wouldn't they? It's obviously what the ABC seems to think. Look, this is an extraordinary story. This is our tax dollars at work. You look like you've got one last thing you want to say there before we close the story, Joe.
Look, it's become a cult, and the cult following, they can justify anything because the planet is at stake. But this makes them quite scary people, and this is why we desperately need more of that pushback, of that hang on a minute, think about what you're doing kind of conversation. And the media is culpable here because the media does not put the other, I'm talking about the mainstream media, of course, they don't put that other side of the story forward. So these people who may have been well-meaning underneath it all, they may just be narcissistic attention seekers, they don't get any of that rational kind of input that slows them down and makes them think twice. And here's the really scary thing. Those people are the editors of the ABC who sent allegedly a Four Corners team out on a 5-hour plane trip to do something which was pretty obviously potentially a criminal act with people at a private home who were on bail. One of them for aggravated burglary with intent. I mean, these are not people you would normally just chuff a team off to film what they were doing next at dawn.
Well, that's our taxpayers' dollars at work, thanks to the ABC. Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we promise we are not going to fly crews from one side of the country to another to cover criminal activity in advance, knowing in advance that it's going to be criminal activity. Thank you so much, Joe Nova, for bringing us this story. Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com. Follow all our socials via @theaussiewire and support us by becoming an insider at theaussiewire.locals.com/support. The link for that is, of course, in the description. We release new episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.